Okay, great, great. Good morning, everyone, or afternoon, or wherever you're viewing us from. Today we're starting the first of our inaugural set of context window live streams.
Yeah.
I like that name
Yes.
better than any of the other names
Because
we
you,
consider.
you came up with it.
Well, the other names were not so great, but we still may make changes as it goes on if we get some negative feedback. So these are going to be a series of live streams that myself and Anant Jingran are going to be doing. Very excited to be working with Anant again. Anant, introduce yourself, because I can't ever do justice to your long set of accomplishments.
Oh, stop it. Hey, hey, everybody. Hey, I'm Anant Jingran. I am the CTO for IBM Software, but I've had a pleasure of working with Ed deeply for maybe a decade. Okay.
I think longer than that.
Longer
Scary to
than
say.
that. Yeah, absolutely. So it's just a pleasure to kind of get a chance to talk to you again.
It is. Just for context, Anant and I worked together at Apogee and at Google, and now soon we'll be working together at IBM in the near future. And so we're pretty excited about that. And what we wanted to talk about today was an area that is near and dear to our hearts in terms of what is happening with connecting models, large language models, and agents to capabilities through the form of tools, and really that's standardized pretty recently around MCP, and so that's a topic we're going to talk a lot about today.
Absolutely. And of course, we'll continue this conversation with other topics. All of us are very passionate about how evolution in technology meets enterprise needs. That's what we were trying to do in the world of APIs. If you recall, we took the lessons from Netflix as an example of kind of a born on the web company and said, how do you actually bring that to the worlds of the Home Depots, for example, right? So that's what we'll try to do, is to do understand what's happening in the Valley, for example, but really bring it home for all of you who are trying to get some jobs done.
Yeah, and there's a lot of parallels there that we saw, which were that you had a new type of applications being built that were leveraging APIs, and now we are at a point where people are building these agentic applications, and they're figuring out how to connect them to their data and apps, and particularly within enterprises that we spend a lot of time working with, and trying to sort of separate out what is the hype from what is fact, what is where should how well should I expect this stuff to work, and so part of what we want to do in these is really do a reality check. Both you and I are big proponents that you should learn by doing, and the advice that you and I have given many folks in IT and in business and enterprises over the years is that you need to go and get your hands dirty in building these things, but there's a lot of things to figure out. The space is moving very quickly, and so hopefully as we do this, we can actually shine a light on where these things are. I know you're involved in a lot of prototypes that people are building in enterprise customers, and we see a lot of POCs as well as seeing a lot of or growing number of production success stories. And so hopefully as we approach this, as we go into topics like MCP, that we can come from that perspective, which is what should you be building now, and how ready is this now for you to be building things around.
Awesome. And just to kind of build on that point, Ed, I think that this world is changing so fast. I mean, you know this, right? We used to measure in decades the impact of stuff. The world of APIs probably took at least 10 years, and there was a world of SOAP and XML before that.
Yeah.
But here, things are changing really, really fast. And it's almost impossible, really impossible, to not chase after the next shiny object, right?
Yeah.
And if you chase after the next shiny object, then your head is spinning. So
Yeah.
what we will try to do, at least I'll try to do, kind of in a relatively humble way, and same for you, Ed, is that focus on things that will remain a constant.
Yep.
Okay, as opposed to things that are changing rapidly. And that's why, for example, I'm very excited about this MCP topic, because it kind of separates out all the rapid innovation that's happening with things that have to be done irrespective of that rapid innovation.
Yeah, one of the things I do want to point out, you and I have had this conversation many times. So we're going to say MCP, and we're going to talk a lot about MCP. What we're really excited about is the idea that models now and this agentic, interactive, in many cases chat-based, but it's conversational ability combined with the model's ability to do reasoning, break things out into steps, and figure out what steps should be taken to accomplish a specific task. When you combine that with capabilities that are brought in that exist beyond the model, now it becomes possible to have this model do things for you. And for a while within models, that capabilities, when we say capabilities, we in LLM speak, we mean tools, and these were things that people were building by hand. But the reason why we like MCP, and by the way, because I can inevitably hear other people in the comments going and saying, "Oh, but what about ACP or A2A or all of these others?" It's like, no, those are right now. In fact, one of the things we'll talk about a little bit more later is, like, MCP is the front runner, but the big idea here is models being able to have capabilities outside the model that are actions that they can take. And so that's why we like it, is that even though the implementation or manifestation, because I get people all the time going and saying, well, what about MCP versus whatever? I'm like, that really doesn't matter, right? I think
Yes.
yeah.
No, but that's exactly right. So what happens is that, at least the way I have kind of learned this, is that models are becoming really, really powerful.
Yes.
And their degree of knowledge that they have is increasing. We'll ignore kind of scaling laws and everything else, all the kind of the technical discussions around kind of limits around that space. But in the end, as somebody had said, they are a stochastic parrot on stuff that they have been shown.
Yeah.
Right? As much as it's kind of awe-inspiring everything else, the stuff that has been shown. But the way this happens is that it's almost impossible to show kind of enterprise data. It's impossible to show things that are changing rapidly because, for example, of course, in some way, shape, or form, right, models cannot be trained every day
Right.
with new stuff. So people have tried kind of various techniques like RAG and others to kind of bring some context to bear.
Yes.
And it has always felt, in my view, kind of a patchwork, okay, around certain things. And I think this concept of tools and tool calling and MCP-enabled tools and tools calling seems to be kind of much more principled way in which LLMs can actually connect with external information.
Well, it's an important software abstraction, contract-based, that allows us to express capabilities that can enhance the context, right? And so RAG, you're right, RAG was a first generation of saying, how do I go and retrieve external content that I'm feeding into the context at test time or inference time? And by the way, that was a good and important thing. The idea that the model was going to have all knowledge that you would ultimately need was impractical, right? And so you then started to see a lot of abstractions around that for, like, okay, I want to ask a model, something based on a current stock price, to give the simplest possible example. That is something that can't possibly be in the model's knowledge set. I need to retrieve that externally. But then we start seeing the myriad set of information sources, and that's where you started to see a lot of what I would call sort of advanced retrieval architectures. A lot of people are going to say, "Oh, that's not RAG," and I'm like, "Well, you're augmenting your context for the sake of generation via retrieval, that is kind of RAG with more steps. But regardless, you then actually started to bring tools into the equation. So it wasn't just retrieval. It was like, let me do other things. And so that's that pattern. And so it's really important for people to understand this pattern. So I would say actually for the folks that are going and saying, well, I don't really get like, agents, MCP or whatever, like that idea that you need to go and bring external information into this agent. And by the way, ChatGPT or Claude or anything that you're actually seeing with the user interface that you're typing into or you're interacting with is an agent. You're actually not talking to the bare model. You're talking to an agent that wraps that model. And so then, in order to make it do useful things, you need to connect that. And so that really is what brings us to MCP, which, again, as we talked about, really provides a well-defined contract for a couple of things. For one, saying what tools are available, and probably more importantly, sort of, a rich semantic description of how those tools can be used.
Yes.
Right? And
yes.
so that now for those of us who come from the API world, that should sound very familiar, right? Which has been which really brings us to the area. You've been doing lots of things with GraphQL. In the past, we've done things with Hypermedia. We were very involved with Swagger, now called OpenAPI, which were all ways of trying to provide a way of expressing the capabilities of APIs. And so there is this overlap between the world of APIs and the world of tools.
Totally. I mean, in effect, in my view, a tool is kind of a combination of two constructs. Obviously, I'm really simplifying it. One is a description of what I do.
Yep.
English language description of what I do. Okay. And an ability to construct specific calls. Okay. So here is my schema, here's my SQL, here's my REST API, here's my GraphQL API. So that if you, LLM God, believe that you need to kind of invoke me, this is how you're going to invoke me. So these two things, one is kind of an introspection of what I do, and second is the ability to kind of call. So for example, if you look at a Postgres tool, a Postgres tool would be kind of a schema description, okay, and the ability to execute the SQL call that kind of comes in, right? So those are kind of two constructs. Now, in the world of APIs, we have always felt that the world of API was awesome in kind of the second part of it, which is give me something and I'll reliably execute on it.
Yeah.
We have always struggled with how do I kind of describe what I do, right? And that's where we have kind of had, in my view, some kind of patchwork things like OpenAPI spec. The reason I say patchwork is it's not kind of inline. And that's why, Ed, as you know, I was supremely excited about GraphQL.
Yes.
Because GraphQL is, whatever its good, bads, and uglies are, is it describes itself, right? So, but in both of those constructs, it was a very, very precise specification. And with that precision came some drawbacks, right?
Yes.
And MCP tries to kind of get rid of those drawbacks by going from very, very precise things to understanding that LLMs have the capability of disambiguating somewhat. So I think what MCP then does is it takes the world of APIs and allows its description, okay, to be more flexible and kind of callable in the context of AI.
I think that's exactly right. I mean, and I think that is the agentic challenge around tool use in a nutshell, both from what are the problems that things like MCP solve, but what you and your developers who potentially are making enterprise capabilities, APIs, services available as tools will face. In the past, there were a variety of schools of thought of how we actually implemented an API at the protocol level. We had everything from RPC-based things rest in terms of how it was popularized, which was more resource paths and JSON, to hypermedia, which is entirely.
I'd forgotten about that one. Absolutely.
Well, and then you had GraphQL, which actually picked up some of the best from both of those from a practical standpoint. Of course, we'll have some of the API purists, and hopefully in our audience, we actually are talking to some of our people, the API people, who are arguing, Ed, there's no relationship between GraphQL and hypermedia. Actually, I do think they're part of a certain lineage. But in any event, that self-describing path, which became very important. But all along the way, you had this documentation problem. This was part of what OpenAPI, big part from a practical standpoint of why people were adopting Swagger that then became OpenAPI, was that it did allow you to go and put some documentation alongside the endpoints in a structured way that allowed you to generate very nice API docs. Many of the websites that you go and visit when you go to look up, how do I use this API, they're actually generated from the OpenAPI file. And the further piece I'll say is like actually, OpenAI themselves, when they first introduced ChatGPT plugins, which was really a first generation attempt at trying to do an MCP-like thing, they actually built it all around, they actually just used OpenAPI Swagger descriptions. By the way, sometimes you see I say OpenAPI and Swagger. I do that for two reasons. One is because I'm an old timer and I still remember when it was called Swagger. The other thing is half the time I've been in conversations where I'm saying OpenAPI, and they go and say to me, "Why do you keep on mispronouncing OpenAI's name?" And I'm like, "No, it's a different thing." So
awesome. Hey, so I think that APIs represent one of the best ways of calling external capabilities.
Yes.
But 2 points I will make. They're not necessarily the only way.
Yeah.
Right? So for example, typically you'll access database not through an API, but by making a SQL call, right? And I'm sure that in data stacks, I'm sure that you measure kind of the difference between people calling SDKs through interfaces or through SQL and other things. So that's one.
Yep.
Right? And MCP tends to then say that now look, irrespective of whether your underlying constructs are API based or database based and everything else, you can kind of describe and call them uniformly. Now, of course, I would have said that GraphQL also does that, but we'll put that aside for a second. But the second point I think which is missed a lot is just like there are good APIs and bad APIs, okay? It turns out that if your backend descriptions are kind of domain centric, they kind of describe the bits and bytes of what you do, okay? As opposed to business centric or kind of end user centric, where they're trying to solve a problem through LLM and agents, you've got that mismatch. So the second point that I'll make is that you can have a plethora of MCP services, okay? But in the end, the LLM will still get confused,
yes,
okay? Because the language that those MCP services are exposing, okay? It's a good protocol, right? But you're going to get totally confused. So we have seen bad API implementations, Ed, right? Where the entire database schema gets expressed as an API,
yes,
right? And we would always say, no, that's not the right way of doing it. And so similarly, MCP is not the answer to bad writing of backend, right? And therefore you've got to kind of carefully think about that some layer in between your kind of domain model and what you want to expose to.
Oh, well, so that's the interesting thing is that, and I think it's part of where you're going to, which is, I mean, you can do MCP wrong, and this is, thankfully you brought up that example because it brings me back to actually the point I wanted to make earlier, but as is often the case with that.
I've got to remind you.
Yes, well, so when we talk about the description, so first of all, MCP gives you better facilities for that description, but crafting that description is super important. Even if ultimately the protocol and the parameters could in fact be SQL. LLMs actually can do a very good job of defining SQL, but what they don't have is the context of what which things to use and why, and if how do I get at a certain type of data, or when would I do this? And so part of what comes into crafting a good tool endpoint for MCP is it really comes down to the context, and the description of when would you want to do this and why would you want to do it. Now, I happen to think when we think about crafting MCP endpoints, I do tend to think that it is better to, particularly in production situations, to give a more reined in endpoint rather than going and just generating SQL. That said, I have seen scenarios where it actually works quite well, where what you're doing is telling the model, I'm querying things from from my lake house or whatever,
Yes.
and you're going to use SQL to express it, but here are the important things, and here are the table names, or here are the things, and then it generates perfectly good stuff. So one of the things that constantly surprises me is that I don't necessarily recommend it for production things, but for ad hoc use cases, you can actually push more capabilities or more work to the LLM, and then just with the proper amount of context, which is like, here's a description of my schemas, here's the typical things, here are example queries. If I want to get an inventory query, here's some examples.
Yeah.
And then it can do very good things, and it actually will then do a better job than perhaps your data analysts who sit around all day writing ad hoc SQL. The model can write ad hoc SQL too, but it needs a lot of context so that it does these things correctly.
Okay, awesome.
Anyway, sorry.
But I'm going to.
Yes.
No. What do you apologize? if you're going to apologize to me like this, then we'll be always.
Well,
apologizing.
I'm known for going off on a tangent.
No, absolutely not, absolutely not. Okay, hey, listen. But I'll make a point here.
Yeah.
And my first lesson in this was about 10 years back. So we are all kind of old people, so we kind of draw examples. But
we
Ed,
don't look at it, I'm sure.
one of us doesn't. Okay. So Ed, so we are doing this kind of API bot detection.
Yes.
And we came up with this really fancy, at that time I don't remember, but it was probably some
Did it
logistic-
actually ever work? It was a while back, so I don't recall.
Yeah.
Okay.
But no,
good,
but
good.
but that's not the challenge.
Okay.
The challenge it did work.
Okay, good.
But our customers came back and said, "Look, please tell us why you're identifying something as a bot."
Oh,
okay?
yes.
So the same thing we are realizing, and this is where there are some really deep issues out there. So you can have let's say that you want to kind of calculate, give me give me how much of salary raise I should give based on people's experiences, okay? And I've got a total budget of $50,000. Let's say, I'm just making it up.
Yeah.
And it does some fancy calculation and says update salary Ed equals 0. Okay.
When you do that one, I want you to use my fine-tuned model.
That has right. But what we're realizing is that our customers say, yes, I know that LLMs can do a lot. Okay. But I want to feel confident.
Yes.
Okay. So there's a difference. So this is very interesting.
Yeah.
I had pushed for the more the tool, the more complex a description that can be done by LLM, the better it is. So we were building these GraphQL tools that would combine different data elements and everything else. And the customers came back and said, no, they want more atomic capabilities.
Yeah.
And clear explanation of first I did this, then I did this, then I did this. So I think this debate between should the LLMs do a lot in one big go, or should they do more in atomic capabilities and be able to then explain why each of those steps have been done? And then the atomic capabilities, Ed, then pose a different problem, which is now you're doing kind of information passing between different MCP servers, right? And how do you know that the information that's passed, that is gotten from one MCP server, is passed reliably into the second one.
Yeah.
So we have been just kind of thinking deeply about whether you want your APIs or MCP servers to do really complex things or really simple things. Okay, and both have their kind of trade-offs.
Well, I mean, yes. So the first piece is there is one of the things I will say, and it from kind of for people who are thinking about this stuff, is that there is a whole architecture, and there will be a whole architectural domain around thinking around MCP usage that will have different answers that depend on the use case, and whether you are doing fine-grained pieces of, and some of that will sit at the agent in terms of the instructions. Some of that will sit within MCP. The other interesting thing that I've seen is I've seen a lot done with MCP composition. And for example, I'll do a little plug for our little open source project Langflow, that allows you to publish an MCP server, but inside it can actually compose, have its own agent that is calling other MCP servers. And so you may actually have multiple agents in the call chain, and it may not be as simple as at the top level going and telling, like you're sitting there in the Claude window and you go and say, by the way, explain to me everything you're doing before you do something. You will need ways for that instruction to get propagated down, because you may have other LLMs in the loop in terms of things that are happening. And so these are the architectural considerations that go into MCP usage. And we're really at like ground zero.
Ground zero,
like,
absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, you and I can have these conversations and we whiteboard them, and I know people are building them. We get them built, but whenever I go out to read some Medium post, it typically is what I'm seeing is the 2025 version of what we used to see 10 years ago, which was like, here's how you expose your database as a REST API, right? And like you map the verbs into SQL and all that stuff. And then like now I'm seeing the same thing. It's like, how do you turn this, how do you turn your database into an MCP server? And it's like, it's great, but that's like very first order stuff. The reality is you're going to have extensive calling chains and things like explainability, and not just explainability, but sort of going and approving. Sometimes you will want to approve each step. In some cases you won't. It's funny actually, in the coding domain where a lot of people are using these agents, they have what the kids call YOLO mode, which is
Bye to all.
yeah.
You only live.
Yeah. Which is basically accept all changes.
Yeah.
Right.
Course.
And you ask it to go and do something, and rather than stopping and asking you, do you approve this? Do you approve this? It's just like blammo, and then.
For those of us who have done Unix installation,
Yes.
there is a parameter called Y to all.
Exactly.
Right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Hey, so I want to kind of get to a kind of couple of other conversations here.
Yeah.
So APIs have been awesome. It's absolutely the case that Ed with your view and other people in Chet and others at Apigee, we were able to kind of pivot to this emerging world of APIs. But we also, during that time, we discovered a few problems.
Yeah.
Right? Where API management could solve some of the problems.
Yeah.
Right? That's what we try to do, which is bring your unwashed masses and we'll surround it with a developer ecosystem, analytics, etc., etc. But then we realized is that API management by itself cannot fix bad implementations behind the curve, right?
That's correct. Yeah. Anyway, keep going. Yeah, you keep going with where you're going on there. Before I interrupt you, you are right that was true. But some of those problems were compositional problems.
Yes.
Some of them were structural problems.
Yes.
And was that where you're going with it? Or
No,
okay.
absolutely.
Yeah.
So what I'm trying to say is that people will talk about management of MCPs, right? People will talk about composition of MCPs and everything else. All great, absolutely great. But the fact of the matter is that if your MCP server, for example, as an example, runs on a small desktop underneath your desk,
Yeah.
right? You'll run into the same set of issues that you were running into, okay, during kind of the API implementation.
Yes.
So that's just an example of that. Just because you are discoverable and pluggable into the ecosystem, which MCP solves for you, doesn't mean that the kind of reliability and access control and the scale is available. Okay, that's one. And then
Yes.
the second point is this: that coming back to the point that I made about 10 minutes back, is that if your what you're describing or executing, okay, is not connecting the dot with what the user is thinking or what the peer MCP service is thinking. So for example, if you are calling something as cust ID and say
Yeah.
that, look, you can get the cust ID this way, and somebody else is calling something else, now you're putting the burden on the LLM to be able to kind of connect the dots between them. So I think the kind of, yes, LLMs kind of take some burden away from you, but that doesn't free you from the responsibility of kind of good architecture, naming, scale, authentication, other things that you got to do.
No, that's absolutely true, and I think that it's interesting that the API management parallels are really good, and again, from what Anant is talking about, is you'd have many people going and saying, okay, let me go and expose something that I have in a very slow inventory system, for example, and go and expose that as an API, right? Which may be the equivalent of having my computer under my desk.
Yeah, of course.
You know, and
grogged into it.
Exactly. So the things that API management did that I think do have parallels. There's a lot of parallels, actually. Even though I do my best not to sort of try to overfit the API management space onto the MCP space. I think that the basic considerations are there. And the basic idea is you end up having sort of a mediation layer that can do various things to mitigate.
Exactly right. That's exactly what I'm saying.
Yeah, well, because the point is that, and we use that example, it might be the computer under my desk, or whatever, but the reality is, even at massive scale, there'll always be one request more than what your infrastructure can handle. Mm-hmm. Like even if you've got 10,000 servers, right? Like what happens when I have one more request than I can handle? And so that's where there are a set of patterns that API management was able to implement, things like circuit breaker pattern and things like that, or caching or whatever, that were things that made it possible to handle it. There is a new set of those in the world of MCP, but the more interesting thing is that with LLM in the loop, it can actually have if set up right, it can actually have sort of an executive function that is self-monitoring, that can go and then actually issue recommendations, which you could do in a suggestive way or in an automatic way, which is to go and say, maybe I should use this tool rather than this one because this one has more of an expense associated with it. Mm-hmm. I also do think that there is a component that probably should be more formally expressed within the MCP specification. We're in the early days of this, but there should be some form of, either through a form of MCP management layer or in the protocol itself, that has something of the back-end resources being consumed. Because if I have two ways of getting at something, and one of them is more heavyweight, like right now the models are good at calculating their expense, their compute expense. It's not associated with the model, excuse me, it's the agent, the agentic model, the agentic interface that has a good sense of conserving GPU resources, right? Mm-hmm. Like if you go, whether if you're using Claude or you're using ChatGPT, right, and they're throttling GPUs, or you can choose deep research mode, in which case it goes full agentic, or Claude has some settings around that as well. But what they're not doing is doing a good job of managing the rest of your resources in an MC call chain. And it could be quite inefficient at running something that might be going and hitting your ERP backend that might not be burning up GPUs, but it could be burning up something else that's very expensive too.
Absolutely. So anyway, so the point I think that you are making and that I started to make is that good system design doesn't go away.
Right.
Just because you can kind of do stuff in a more flexible way.
But they're new considerations, and this is why if you are an enterprise architect who's looking at this, sitting on the sidelines, and saying this is just API management part 2 or SOA part 3 or whatever term you want to use, no, there's a whole new set of considerations that for many folks this is going to be like what happened when you tried to plug your existing APIs into like mobile apps, and you had an API that was designed for doing 10 requests a second, and now you suddenly are calling it in a geolocated app that's hammering the thing. Now you've got new calling structures. You now have, like if you're naively exposing your database, this thing may be generating very expensive SQL commands to try to answer things to the user that may go and suddenly blow your costs out of the water, right? So you will, if you're look, the good news is, if you learn this stuff, if you are an enterprise architect, you're going to be busy for the next 20 years, right?
Full Employment Act.
Full Employment Act. If you're not paying attention to it, it is going to just be like when these previous generations of architecture came on scene.
Ed, I want to kind of switch gears to something else that's been on the top of my mind. In the world of APIs, there was this Postman that allowed people to kind of test drive APIs.
Yes.
And of course, Postman itself, presumably, or others will kind of provide tools to test drive MCP.
Yeah.
Okay, there's no problem. Claude provides one, and others will provide. That's no issue. Okay, and I can go and atomically test an MCP server. The problem that I see is that when LLMs get involved, okay, the reliability of an MCP server saying, okay, give me the weather in Tallahassee. Where is Tallahassee, Florida?
I believe so.
Tallahassee, Florida, right now. Okay, it is able to kind of convert it into a call. But the minute you start to sequence things together, there's no repeatability in my test, right? Oh my God, okay, it got it right. But the second time it said it went off in some weird thing. So how do we think about testing our implementation of MCP servers, which is no longer just about does one MCP server do the right thing, but does the LLM chain together its own COT, chain of thought reasoning, and connect with the MCP servers? And I've kind of been kind of tearing my hair out, okay, because it does the right things often if I use Claude Desktop, but often it goes off in a ditch and I have to kind of force it to try and use an MCP server when it's trying to be really, really smart.
Yeah.
So how would we think about testing? Whereas in the world of APIs, testing was very simple. You wrote definitive programs that called APIs, then you saw what the response was.
Well,
how did you think about this one?
Well, because what happened is typically the invocation of APIs was deterministic. And so I could write a program, or I could use Postman. I could just deal with these things in isolation and see what was happening. And now, as you pointed out, if I sit down with Claude Desktop and I have a bunch of MCPs, and I ask it to do something or to get some information for me or what have you, depending on how those MCP servers are crafted, how their descriptions are worded and things like that, or whether Claude's just having a bad day or not, which, happens because the reason why you see the variety is because they're doing throttling behind the scenes. But anyway, that's a separate conversation.
I won't comment on that.
Anyway, the point is that there's two paths to it. One is at developer time, we do need better sort of observability and being able to do these traces. But the second piece is that you touched on is that I do believe that you aren't just going to put the human or the developer chatting and typing things. I do think you're going to end up having to actually use you're actually going to have to generate a synthetic test set of things that people will, of tasks that I ask the agent to do, and then I'm going to have to feed those and map those to invocation chains. And I'm going to have to do that. I'm going to have to let it run and then come back. So I do predict that there will be a QA cycle that is involved with generating a whole bunch of synthetic tasks with a prediction of which tools should be used to do that, and then we'll probably will need to be a human in the loop in terms of looking at that and verifying that in fact, that those are the tools I meant to be used. But I do think that'll be necessary. I for that particular situation you're talking about. So long and shorter is I think there's going to be a lot of need for QA tools, because otherwise you're not going to get a good representative set. You just doing it, testing in production, and I put it in front of, I go and say, great, let me roll this out to all my users, and then I come back later and I find that like one person did something that the model couldn't figure out, or conversely turned into this. Because sometimes I've seen both problems. I've seen the one which is like, why isn't it using this damn tool? But I also see the flip side one, which is like, why is it calling it? Why did it keep calling it 200 times in a loop and not figure out like that it wasn't getting what it wanted, right? Like, so you get both of those, and those edge cases. I think you're going to need synthetic data. I would be curious what your perspective is on that.
No, I think that's exactly right. I have one perspective here, which is that there's a continuum between developers programming fixed chains.
Yeah.
So they're opening up Langflow, for example.
Yeah.
And saying A, B, C, versus an LLM deciding first A, then B, then C. Okay. And so what we have observed is that sometimes having these kind of LLM-like capabilities available to the developer allows her to figure out what things to sequence. And what we find is that if at the end of that operation, if there's, let's say, what I'd call a freeze dry button.
Yes.
Okay. And what that freeze dry button then does is it says, okay, there are lots of digressions and LLM did something wrong or agent did something wrong. And the human brought them back and said, look, no, that's not what I meant. Are you sure? I said, please.
Yes.
Right? And it kind of came back. Now what you say is, okay, I got something that I know works reliably for this thing. Can I freeze dry it and get the LLM out of the way?
That is a much better solution.
And
yes.
convert it. Okay?
Yeah.
Now it doesn't work for
Yeah.
unknown problems and everything else.
Yeah.
But if you believe that the world is full of known problems and unknown problems, to go back to
Yes.
Donald Rumsfeld's old world, right? You have to be able to kind of use some of these unknown techniques and then bring them back into the known techniques.
Yeah, that is absolutely right. And I've heard that variance of the freeze dry pattern, and I do think you're absolutely right. I think that piece, from a composition standpoint, is going to make sense. And this is one of the things that, by the way, even myself, who has come from, I say it's an old timer who comes from the very deterministic world, I still get so hypnotized by the flexibility of the models that I sort of forget. No, actually, if the model determines that there's a deterministic, or that the best way of solving things is a fixed set of steps, then there's no reason why I shouldn't be able to have a freeze dry button that goes and says, okay, next time you're asked something similar, let's take that set of steps and turn it into a new MCP server, for example, that encapsulates it so that the model doesn't have to reinvent the wheel. The model just now knows that it has a new capability that is perhaps more outcome focused, right? Like, okay, I'm in a business use case and I went through all these steps because I had to figure out how to deal with escalating the customer and doing a refund, right? And it involved all of these steps of reading a bunch of documents and doing all of this stuff. Next time, I shouldn't have to do those steps. I should be able to freeze dry that, and it now knows, oh, here is my, customer escalation MCP that has a description that tells me how to match that condition, and then has encapsulated the steps. It doesn't involve going and reading our customer support policies on the website. Doesn't involve having to query 10 different systems. It's now an efficient thing, saves GPU cost, enhances reliability, gives a predictable outcome. Yeah, I agree with that 100%.
Right, and just
Yeah.
so I actually fundamentally believe that there's a continuum between procedural code that you write, okay, and agentic stuff that you discover on the fly. And typically people have said, okay, let's figure out whether my problem falls on side A or side B.
Yeah.
But what I'm learning is that it's really a continuum.
Yeah.
Okay. And you can use agentic techniques to improve your procedural stuff. You can use procedural techniques to improve your agentic stuff. And at the center of it is all these MCP servers that are either connected deterministically or connected. So in the end, as this world evolves, the thing that remains constant is how do you describe enterprise capabilities? How do you describe what can be done? And that's why we are super duper excited about MCP.
Exactly.
Do we have questions? Do we know? Okay. Okay. So what are the things that we should ask our listeners to do, given all the things that are happening, right? What is it that we can...
So I think a couple of things. So first, I would go and say, if you are coming to this from the API world, I would go and suggest that you actually go and build an MCP server. There's a variety of ways to do that. There are high-level tools to do it, things like Langflow. You could do it in Python code, but get into this is and I went through this process. It was actually about a year ago or so when tools first emerged on the scenes. But I talked to some of my colleagues in the world of APIs and so on. And they still haven't done it yet. I would say you do want to get in. That'd be my first piece. Would be get an intuitive sense of what the models do and don't do and how they do it. I think you'll be surprised in some areas. In a lot of areas actually, there'll be things that you didn't think was possible that you'll be like, oh my God. There'll be things that you do think should be possible, and then you're like, for the life of me, I can't get it to work. You do need to do that. I feel like it's very important to get hands-on in that piece. So that would be my first piece. What would you toss in there?
So I think that's in the end, you're going to take the first step, and that's an awesome first step. I have come to realize that if you're coming from an API world, that your API design, okay, makes or breaks what actually happens.
Yeah.
Okay, and you would say, why? Why is it? Aren't LLMs smart enough to actually paper over your bad implementation? Okay, and it turns out they aren't, right? They aren't, okay, because you've got to be able to kind of connect the dots. You've got to be able to describe things in business context and everything else. So what we have realized is that, and of course, I've got a hammer called GraphQL that I'm a big fan of, that good API design makes for great tools. Okay, bad API design makes for okay-ish tools. Okay?
I think absolutely right. Absolutely right.
And so experiment with what allows you to take whatever APIs you have and convert it into something that makes for great tools. One of the tools that I would offer is kind of a GraphQL layer that kind of is able to kind of mix and match over the differences and enable you to express something not. You may decide on something else, but a good design cannot be avoided, even though MCP servers allow you to not be as prescriptive as you would have been in the past.
I think that's absolutely true. I think the interesting wrinkle I would throw on that is, as part of that, the documentation problem is slightly different. When we were authoring APIs, whether GraphQL or REST or otherwise, for a human, the examples we gave and so on, we were worried about the attention spans and all that sort of thing. The models have a lot better attention. They read everything. They actually.
Attention is everything that they need. What is that?
It's
What-
all, yes, exactly.
it's all-
Attention is all you need. And
They've taken it to heart.
I think in a world where people are increasingly attention deficit, luckily the models are not. The context windows are getting bigger and bigger.
Yes.
Which is a callback to our title,
title,
our live stream
title
title.
of the series.
But the context and supplying the context around the tools is king. And so the interesting part is in that API designing, describing the business rationale of why you would use it, describing the technical details, so the precision, but sort of belaboring the point doesn't hurt for the model because the model hangs on every word in that documentation, and it's and so it changes. I think this carries across everything. When you start getting into this thing, whether you're doing it from an MCP standpoint, whether you're coding, the model pays attention. It reads the comments, it reads the docs, and it changes that thing. You're no longer authoring for a human. Mm-hmm. You're authoring for a model that will pay attention to everything you wrote, and that changes the API design equation.
A good point. That's an awesome point, which is don't put swear words in your
well, there's a debate as to whether now the whole debate as to whether you should be being polite or not.
Yeah, of course we saw that. Hey,
yes.
Listen, I'm from IBM, so I would strongly caution people not to use swear words.
Exactly, and to be polite,
and polite, of course.
Yes.
Hey, listen, this has just been an awesome discussion.
This was great.
This is. We enjoyed it.
Yes.
I don't know whether you all did or not. But what are some of the other topics that we think we should explore in this series?
So I think we have a couple of different ones that we've wanted to come at this from. I think we're certainly going to, we spent the first time talking a lot about MCP because I think it very timely but we are going to do a lot more conversation around how you use your data in models. That's one of the areas that you and I have spent a bunch of time on over the last few years, solving the relevancy problem. And so I think we're gonna cover some of those things too, right? In fact, a lot of people were like, when we were talking about our first topic, they were like, Anant and Ed, but you guys have been working in data for the last couple of years. Why are you starting with data? And we said, well, we'll get.
No, but we have worked longer in APIs.
We certainly have.
We've worked longer in APIs. So
yes.
Listen.
Yeah.
Listen. Before this, I was talking to somebody about a Beatles song, and she said, "What's Beatles?" but for us,
yes.
right? We have been old habits die hard.
Exactly.
APIs was it? No, actually, honestly, I have been working longer in data. Right,
but you've caught up at this point, have you? I mean,
before that, okay.
Yes.
So I think that's a really important topic. The second thing that I would kind of really try to address is my view that in the end, if you can't depend on something, it is entertainment.
Yeah.
Okay. And there are many places where there's a human in the loop that can decide between whether she can depend on it or not. Or as a developer, you can look at the code that's generated and send it to a compiler, and the compiler will say WTF.
Yeah.
Right? Those are awesome where AI is acting as a co-pilot. But if AI is making workflow decisions, if AI agents are sitting in the middle and deciding, how do you actually trust, what's really going on? And I think that's, in my mind, you've gone from the realm of, oh my God, look at what it can do, to can I actually bet my business on something? Okay?
Yeah.
And that gap between wow and I can bet my is a gap that I think we need to address. So I'm going to talk a bit about whenever we get a chance on this. But of course, obviously, if our audience wants to kind of suggest some topics that you think that combination of AI, data, and APIs as our kind of things that we know, And we'll be very happy to bring in other guests
Yeah.
also. I mean, obviously, in the end, I'll get bored of just chatting with you. So
That's inevitable.
that's inevitable. Absolutely right. So it'll just be awesome to do this. So hopefully we'll do this again at in maybe what in like
I
3
believe
weeks?
I believe we're scheduled to do the next one.
And at IBM Think
we're going to be at IBM Think on
IBM Think,
on the floor of IBM
it
Think. So
it will be
this is great. I think that, and if hopefully hopefully everyone watching this enjoyed it. If you want to get a flavor of many of the things that we've been thinking about, and at least the stuff that Anant and I are passionate on solving, and what is guiding our thoughts, please keep tuning in, because these are a lot of the great ideas that are driving some of the types of things that we hope to try to spend more time on in the future.
And as you can see, I just really I learn a lot from Ed. He's turning red in case you can't you can't see that.
Yeah.
But I'm really looking forward to the time when I'll be able to kind of welcome you into IBM. Hopefully that happens soon, and then we'll get a chance to work even better together for all of our customers.
Looking forward to it.
Okay, awesome. Thank you very much, folks.